Lesson 11, multiplying and dividing real numbers. There are several properties that we can use when we're multiplying. The identity property of multiplication. If you want to use capital IPOM for identity property of multiplication, you may. That is when you take A times 1, that's going to equal the same thing as 1 times A or A. And here's an example of that identity property. 1 times 7 equals 7. Then we have the multiplication property of -1. There is no shorthand for that one. That just says that if you take a number and multiply it by -1, it's going to give you a negative of that number. So A times -1 is the same thing as -1 times A, which is -A. And an example would be if we did 7 times -1, we're going to get -7. That's called the multiplication property of -1. There's another property called the zero property of multiplication. And you may shorthand that as ZPOM for zero property multiplication. That just says if you take any number and times it by 0, you will get 0. So A times 0 equals 0. Here's an example. 7 times 0 equals 0. The inverse property of multiplication. Since we already have the IPOM, we're going to do INV, I-N-V, POM. That's going to separate the identity and the inverse. So as long as A does not equal 0, so if A does not equal 0, then A times 1 over A equals the same thing as 1 over A times A, which equals 1. So here's an example. If I take 7 times 1/7, I get 7 over 7, which is 1. And here's another example, 2/3 times 3/2. So notice that we're taking the reciprocal of the fraction. This equals 6 divided by 6, or 1. That's an example of the inverse property of multiplication. Now if we're multiplying or dividing signed numbers, so if the two numbers that you're multiplying or dividing have the same sign, so two numbers with the same sign, the product and or quotient is positive. So here's an example. 3 times 4 is a positive 12. -5 times -3 is a positive 15. The signs are the same, so the product is positive. Now if we're dividing 20 divided by 4, signs are both positive, the answer will be positive. If we're dividing -30 by -6, the quotient will be a positive 5. Both of the signs are the same, so the answer is positive. If you're given two numbers with opposite signs, that means one's negative, one's positive. The product or quotient is negative. So if I have -3 times a positive 2, the answer will be a -6. If I have 6 divided by -3, the quotient will be -2. -20 divided by +5, the quotient will be -4. When we are dividing fractions, that's when we think of the saying, keep it, change it, flip it. Some kids have learned it copy, dot, flip, which is the same thing. Keep it, change it, flip it. Okay, that means, let's do an example. 2/3 divided by a -3/4. I have a positive divided by a negative. I know right away that my answer will be negative. So the keep it means rewrite the fraction, the first fraction as 2/3. Change it means take the division, change it to multiply. Flip it means take the last fraction and flip it upside down. Now we're multiplying straight across. 2 times a -4 is -8, and 3 times 3 is 9. So the answer would be -8/9. If we are raising a number to a power, that means it's going to have an exponent. If we have a negative number, let's say we have -2 raised to the 4th power, because 4 is even, we're going to have a positive product. So we're multiplying -2 times -2 times -2 times -2. You can think of it as multiplying 2 of those together. So -2 times -2 is a +4. You can multiply the other 2 negatives together and get a +4, and 4 times 4 is 16. Now, if you have a negative number raised to an odd power, the answer will be negative because you have an odd number of negatives. So the 2 that go together will be positive, but then you're still multiplying by 1 negative. So this is going to be -8. And that's the end of the lesson.